All right, great. Okay, thanks for joining. I'm excited to be here with you today. My name is Mandy Walls. I'm going to be talking about the best practices for on-call teams. A bit about me, just as an intro, if I don't know you. My name is Mandy Walls. I'm a DevOps advocate at PagerDuty. If you'd like to get in touch with me, I'm on Twitter at LNXCHK, or you can email me, mwalls@pagerduty.com if you have any questions or would like to know more about what we do or whatever else. So today I'm going to be talking about stuff about on-call, right? But what do I actually mean by on-call? Some of us maybe have sort of this default idea of what on-call means. Maybe you've experienced it in the past, maybe you haven't, right? So some teams just don't do it, right? In the most basic sense, on-call really describes a state in which some employees are available to be notified for unplanned incidents, alerts, issues for some number of systems or services or applications that their organization runs. In the very early days of commercial internet, before many folks had sort of the 24/7 access or access to reliable mobile data services, companies would provide their employees with a text-based one-way or two-way pager so they could be available around the clock in case they were needed. It may surprise you to know that's where PagerDuty got its name, right? Originally, that was sort of the thing that was done. And while we've moved past that, the idea of how on-call works and what its goals are really have evolved, but are still there. So why do we do on-call? If we're on a team that is responsible for customer facing, consumer facing services, you probably know how unpredictable users can be, right? Did they really expect someone to do their banking or ordering groceries at 3 o'clock in the morning or using your service in a way it wasn't intended? Like, users are kind of unpredictable that way. Our goal as technologists, as managers, isn't to punish teams for writing bad code or for having issues. It's really to improve the overall reliability of the team's services and systems and the things that you're responsible for. Unfortunately, for lots of complex distributed systems, the best way to do that is when they get into the production environment and they get exposed to whatever interesting things the users might get up to, as well as the production versions of any kind of like backend dependencies and other components in the environment. So customers now assume that services are going to be up and running all the time, not just during limited business hours, and they're not, necessarily during the same time as like brick and mortar might be open. And in addition to these customer expectations, the increasing complexity of modern services makes it more and more difficult for general purpose operation centers to effectively respond to all the idiosyncratic alerts that might be generated. So teams that would have traditionally been spared an on-call responsibility are increasingly expected to have some kind of responsibility for their services during their off hours. With on-call, you're looking to bring in your subject matter experts, your SMEs, as early in the incident response process as possible. You don't want to be sort of flailing around looking for the right person because you're not sure who that person is or what team they're on or where they are. It's important to be accessing the right people at the right time so that you are minimizing how long it takes to acknowledge and resolve and fix the problems that you're working on. You also want to minimize the number of handoffs and the number of context switches that happen during the resolution process. So you don't want the first person to come in, do a lot of digging around and gathering up of information and say, oh, well, this isn't really my team, and then hand it off. You want to find the right person the first way out the gate. So who goes on call in the what we think I think of as the bad old days, right? Application teams might have handed their code over to an operations team to install it and run it and manage it over time. And this is part of what I did for work years and years ago. I was a systems administrator, and you basically be there with a catcher's mitt hoping that the code landed in the right place. And it causes no end of issues with the successful running of an application in production. the people who knew the most about the applications weren't involved in the full application lifecycle. Like the tests are green, the trap is clean, and off the code goes to the next part of its life. So when we talk about who goes on call, it truly can mean anybody in our organization, right? You might have folks that are on call for marketing, for emergencies, or anything like that. But we're going to focus on folks who are sort of application engineers who are then going to own their code and become part of that on-call response team. So as more teams explore DevOps and SRE models, you have a wider range of individual contributors who would not have been on call even just a few years ago, and they're finding themselves with these on-call responsibilities. The most impactful change, like I said, is the application development teams are playing a larger role in taking care of the code they write when it reaches production, even pre-prod environments that they might not have been responsible for in the past. So when we have the need to reduce the amount of time it takes to respond to a problem, having the folks who know the code best as our responders is a huge benefit, and it makes a huge impact on how we respond and how well that response plays out. One thing to keep in mind is that responders will have on-call responsibility for the areas of their expertise. We have another whole set of talks that we do about what we call full service ownership, where the role of application developers is, this life cycle ownership. And we have a whole guide about that. Translating that for your organization might look different from different organizations depending on how you are dividing up platforms and things like that. But what we're really looking for is the folks who know this component the best are the ones who will respond when that component alerts. So you might have suddenly more and more teams that will have some kind of on-call rotation. You might have folks that are on call for your Linux platforms. You might have folks who are on call specifically for things that are going on in AWS or in Azure or GCP. You might have folks that are on call for data layers and things like that. And then you have this additional benefit of having your application engineers on call for the application problems that might be things from garbage collection to errors to whatever that might be that are specifically related to the behavior and production running of that application. So having on-call rotation really should mean a better on-call experience for your team, right? Your team members will know exactly when they need to be available to respond to incidents on a regular schedule. We think about, at any given time, I might need to contact one of those engineers. And if they don't have an explicit schedule for me to look at and say, okay, well, this week Brian is on call for this team, so I'm going to contact Brian. Instead, if there's no schedule and I say, well, the only person I know on this team is Brian, so I'm going to call him even though I called him last week on something else. Like, that's not fair to that person who happens to be the one who answers their phone, right? So you're really setting out a better practice for the team to know when to be available, who will get called, what they might be called for explicitly, what they own, so that they can sort of, schedule their life around that and make adjustments as necessary so that they're not just randomly being called because they happen to be the person someone knows, right? Your team can also choose what sort of schedule meets your goals. You might have applications that don't actually require a 24/7 response. So you can schedule your on-call rotations appropriately. There are plenty of models that might be more like 8x5 or 24/5, depending on the application. You might have some follow the sun capabilities, right? Or team members in different time zones who can share shifts in increments of less than 24 hours. So if you have folks in, say, Berlin and Seattle, you can use that 9-hour time difference to your advantage and minimize the sleep time interruptions. So some of our teams at PagerDuty take advantage of that because we have some folks in Australia and then folks in Europe and North America. And finally, the last sort of folks are in Pacific time zone. So some of the response teams come on board 9 o'clock in the morning, Sydney time. And then we have on-call presence until midnight Friday night Pacific time. So the amount of other overlap is shortened to just a few hours over Saturday into Sunday. So you can take advantage of as many of those things as you have available. So let's talk about setting a couple of best practices sort of out the gate, right? Before folks get too wound up about everything, right? So one of the things that we looked at when we were thinking about this was the practice of having a handoff meeting, right? And unfortunately, not enough organizations do this as a regular practice. They might just do it when there is a big incident, which is fine. It's a good start, but you should really get into the habit of doing it as often as you hand off your on-call. At the end of a shift, you basically have maybe a meeting or an email or some other kind of information sharing where your outgoing responder, your primary, summarizes all of the incidents, anything else that happened. Maybe they know about recent deployments across major systems. Maybe there's stuff that's still unresolved, that's maybe been muted, but is still active and running as a problem. There might be queued work from prior incidents to be on the lookout for. There might be changes to documentation or access or dependencies or other components. All these sort of production knowledge things that the on-call person is maybe the first consumer of, they can then pass off to the next person as they come on to on-call. So it's really to help your entire team build up all of the context that they need to appropriately respond to any issues that come up. Because context is constantly changing. Other teams that integrate with your project, they're developing things just as quickly as you are. So as their stuff changes, you should be aware of it as well if it impacts you, right? So if it comes up during an on-call shift, we make sure that next person who comes on to on-call knows about it as well. Something else to talk about with your team, and this is maybe less of an issue than it was before the pandemic, since like before March of last year, more people were in an office with a desktop and not at home with a laptop. So the pandemic sort of created this opportunity for lots more people to work from home. So you might already have, say, things like your laptop with lots of power adapters and dongles and maybe some monitors and other things you have at home. Other things to think about with your team, depending on where they're located and things that are maybe needed, talking to them about, the availability of home internet access and what their, current setup looks like, and if it's okay for the kind of response they'll need to have, making sure they have access to backups and things like that, maybe docking stations or dongles or other connectors. It might be worth having a larger discussion inside your organization for just how much of that stuff you offer to most employees on a regular basis. A lot more organizations, because of the pandemic, are definitely looking at providing more benefits towards work from home and a better experience there. And that also increases your ability to respond to incidents during an on-call. And then you also want to make sure you've got a checklist of things that folks will need when they go on call. And hopefully this is part of your onboarding already, but it should be a living document that you are sort of constantly curating and making sure that it's up to date. So working copies of your repos, just in case your version control system happens to be offline as well. Making sure you're configured for environments and you have access, you have credentials, you have whatever VPN access you need, and you know how to use it. You maybe have access to keys or any of those sort of physical pieces as well. Making sure that everyone has passwords and permissions to all of the environments and all of the tools you might need, whether you're using something that's a little bit abstracting or if people are logging into things directly. Also, access to monitoring and dashboards. Some of those solutions can be kind of expensive, but a longer downtime is more expensive than any licensing you'll pay for those. So making sure folks have access to as many things as they need when they need to be able to respond is super important, and something to keep an eye on over the entire lifetime of your applications. So talk a little bit then about team norms, right? The actual people interaction part of having an on-call team, because there's some sticky things about it, right? So things you should be responsible for, right? As the on-call person, you're there to triage an alert, right? You're looking at what's come in, what's been reported, can you fix it? Then you're helping to mobilize, maybe you need someone else who has another set of expertise. We call this, never hesitate to escalate, right? If you need someone else's help or another team's help, and then you go through the resolution portion of actually getting things fixed for the users. And eventually you might get into prevention, although as your first responders, that's not part of your main responsibilities. That's sort of down the pike, and the entire team should take a bit of responsibility into that. But you might have a post-mortem process to take care of. You might have, other checks and things to do there. You might want to write it up for your handoff or other kinds of post-incident notifications so that folks know what's going on there. So those are your key responsibilities, right? And depending on how busy your on-call is, that's probably enough, right? So taking a look at the things you shouldn't be responsible for when you're on call, right? When a member of your team is the primary on-call responder, you need to modify their regular workload. And we do not see enough of this, unfortunately. Alerts and incidents are work. They are unplanned work, but they are work. And you're hopefully attempting to plan for in some way. You're trying to build some capacity, build some space in the schedule, and you need to do that by reducing the number of tasks in a sprint when a team member will be on call, right? So if you have a 2-week sprint and any given week, one person is going to be the primary, that person should not be taking a full development workload, knowing that they are going to have incident response responsibilities. I pound the table about that. It's super important. Remind responders too that if they're not adding value to an incident, they should disengage. Like, don't sit on that call, don't hang out, just let it go, become a stakeholder to be on the receiving end of later announcements if they need to track the resolution or double check something on your systems later. But if they're not helping, like, step back, right? If you don't know, maybe it's interesting to listen to, but at the same time, if you're listening to something at 3 o'clock in the morning, you're probably not absorbing anything useful there. So, like, back off and go to bed, right? And then you don't actually have to spend every waking moment on alerts, right? Prioritize the things that come in. Some stuff, yeah, you're going to have to want to fix, right? Other things, it comes in at 2:15, you're like, nobody's using that thing right now anyway. Make it okay to sort of put that on pause until working hours so that that can be responded to during the daytime, right? Have that kind of practice. Make sure that your folks know that you can prioritize things that way. And then know that everybody is not going to solve absolutely everything. You're going to escalate to other teams. You're going to call in for other help. You definitely do not want to set up this kind of martyr culture for your on-call responders. They're there to provide a service to you, sure, but at the same time, you want to make sure that they're preserving their own sanity and not burning out on being on call. And also make switching shifts super easy. Some of us might have had, some trauma in the past. Maybe we worked retail or food service and you had to find your own cover and all these kinds of things if you were going to be out. And that's really bad practice, right? One of the critical considerations when you have a team that is going on call is maintaining that work-life balance as best you can. People are human, right? They have other things in their life other than, your applications and the things that you're doing. So making sure that they have the ability to plan around vacations. No one wants to, miss a child's birthday party for on-call or anything like that. Have a plan if there's an emergency, right? Use your override functions on your schedules. So if you have something unplanned occur, you don't want to be sitting in the waiting room at the ER trying to get hold of your boss to say, I can't be on call right now. Keep your on-call schedules consistent. Think about how long they should be, if it's 3 days or 5 days or 7 days or however many hours, so that folks can sort of work out, okay, well, I want to be off on June 20th or whatever it is for a birthday. What does that look like in the schedule? Do I need to shift things around? And, teams should have some flexibility to find what works for them in their applications. Be really rigorous about not over prioritizing things. So allowing things to sort of drop off and only be worked on during working hours. So let's talk a little bit about the other cultural aspects that also lead into this and will help you with your on-call. One of the big things that we talk about is empathy, right? Building a supportive culture, maintaining that culture long-term is really responsibility for everyone, right? But especially folks that have on-call responsibilities and their teams have on-call responsibilities. It's worth noting that, we want to have this on-call so that we have less stress. It's, targeted for the folks who know the things the best, and, also gives people a sense of relief a little bit, right? So when they know that they're off call. So a key element of team dynamics really is going to be your empathy. Teams and individuals need to feel empowered to make decisions quickly, to remediate incidents without fear of reprisal, without any kind of punishment later. During an incident, there's a mentality shift that things are going from okay to not okay. And for some folks, this is super stressful and they don't react super well the first few times they do it. So you want to be supportive of folks and help them through all of this. It's okay to not be at the top of your game at 3 o'clock in the morning and like work through things in a more stumbling way than you normally would. It's important to remember that, then the next day too, that if a teammate was up at 4 o'clock in the morning, maybe they're not going to be available at 8:30 if you think you need a meeting with them. So schedule it for later in the day. So having a little bit of additional empathy for your team as they're, especially if they're just coming to on call, to be a little bit more forgiving about things. We also talk a lot about psychological safety because it's important when you're running blameless postmortems, but it's also super important when you're dealing with large incidents or you're dealing with even smaller incidents that have a lot of stress involved. People should feel safe being able to ask questions and to be able to escalate to other teams and not feel like, oh, I don't want to have to call the DBAs because they'll be mad. None of those sorts of things should apply. Your goal is to minimize that incident, minimize that customer impact. And then think about having an onboarding rotation. We call these sort of a shadow rotation where, someone who's new to your team or junior engineer can be sort of the secondary primary. They are paged whenever your primary is, but they can join calls in sort of a listen only mode, right? They're just kind of there to get the feel for things, especially if you're practicing an incident commander, incident response kind of plan. Following along with that the first couple of times is really illuminating for folks who've never seen it before. It's very explicit in the way things are going and the way the meetings are structured. So it's really good for them to listen into that. And then think about what your long-term goals are for the kind of response that you want to be able to provide, right? So some of this is going to be working, if you're just getting started, working with things like MTTA, MTTR. So mean time to acknowledge, mean time to resolve. These are pretty blunt instruments. So if you're not doing anything, they're an okay place to start. As you get more sophisticated, you may want to look at sort of additional data points like not necessarily the time to resolve for every incident, but for specific kinds of incidents, for based on priority, severity, and other categories you might have. So you can do a little bit more number crunching there. You also are looking at, mean time to market for any of the fixes that might come off an incident response, right? So how long from the first time this thing alerted to it's actually fixed permanently in production? How long is that time period? Because if it's a year and you're constantly mitigating this thing, you're wasting a lot of time, right? So looking at those kinds of things as well. And then as engineers for the application are on call, they can work more towards preventing more escape defects, looking at some of the practices that might be in the application and saying, all right, this is not fitting well with our production environment, and being a little bit more proactive for fixing things. So making sure that folks are knowledgeable, that they can escalate to other teams. We know that complex applications in distributed environments will have a lot of interactions, a lot of other things that they're talking to. So making sure that you know how to get other people involved and who they are and where they might be located. This helps to have like an actual platform that you're working with, something like PagerDuty that can help you with that. Don't keep the wrong people involved. Like we said before, you don't have to sit on every outage call that's there. Focus on the folks who can fix things. And then have a way to notify other stakeholders so that somebody gets the all clear later to know that, hey, there was an incident on this backend system, but it's okay now, so they can check their own things. So just to reiterate, escalation is important. You also have to have a way of initiating a major incident to be able to sort of pull that andon cord and say, hey, this started as an alert with my system, but I think it's bigger than us and we need some additional help, and being able to pull that flag and ask for help that way. We do this with an incident commander. So there's a Slack command that actually pages an incident commander into the incident. So a couple things to think about, sort of wrap up, setting some expectations for folks who are new to on-call and setting some etiquette things, right? Make sure you're allowing for rescheduling. Nobody wants to miss an important life event. Be conscious of your backup, right? So if you're the primary on-call, but you're about to go through a tunnel on your future someday commute, right? When you're back to commuting, let the backup know that you're not going to be available while you're commuting. Making sure your team gets enough sleep, that's super important. Keep an eye out for burnout, for people who are on call too much, or their on call is super busy. Maybe if they have been up all night, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you take them off their rotation for the rest of the week. So that helps out too. So just making sure that your folks are taken care of that way. Another way to avoid burnout on the team is to pay attention to the team participation, right? No one wants to feel like they're taking on more than their share of the burden, right? So looking for equal responsibilities, being kind of frank about holiday coverage. If you work in a team that crosses different countries, that has different cultures, you might be able to take advantage of folks having different holidays, right? So maybe have that discussion with folks, but make sure that the same person isn't on call for holidays year after year after year after year. So everybody deserves a break. Monitor the hours of on-call, the number of sleep time disruptions, so that you can action on that, and talk about your good behaviors. So one of the sort of thorny things that might come up on your team is team members really should be sober enough to work when they receive alerts, and it's maybe an awkward conversation to have, but it's common enough. It was a topic on Ask a Manager, which is a super interesting blog. A reader wrote in to ask about how to handle an on-call responder who called into an incident, obviously under the influence, and that's something you don't want your team to have. So as we're all adults and we have our off time practices or activities or whatever they are, just making sure that folks understand that during their on-call shift, they're expected to be able to respond. Couple other things, making sure, again, just to reiterate, because I find this way too often, making sure that you lower the regular workload during an on-call week. Be flexible with folks so that they, you know that they are not going to burn out trying to do absolutely everything. And also other stuff that comes up, like maybe they're not available to do interviews. Maybe they're not available to do mentoring calls or other additional work that piles on with things. So, just being conscious that on-call is work, it's just unplanned. So quickly, some implementation suggestions. Start by taking stock of your alerts, making sure that everything that comes in is actionable, it's useful. Be very ruthless in your prioritization of things. Start with your stable projects. If you're just coming to on-call, take over the stuff that is most stable, that alerts the least. Prioritize your customer-facing services, the things that are in your revenue streams that are super important. Don't overinflate priorities for things that aren't as important as everything else. If you're leveraging a traditional NOC, totally do it. They're there to be helpful as maybe L1 response. Make use of run books where you can to encourage them to help out. You might be able to use something like PagerDuty Rundeck to give them access to environments and help out that way. And also you can cross-train them to be incident commanders, which is part of our incident response program to really make them sort of the traffic cops and the organizers of incident calls. Work with your flexible models, right? Experiment with your shift length, allow follow the sun, right? When you have the ability, change things up for different services or different groups of services that maybe don't need 24/7. And if you have a really small team, right? If you have like a 2 pizza team, 6 or 7 engineers at the most, maybe you can partner with another team that runs a very similar set of services. Maybe you're all working in Java with the same set of frameworks or whatever it is, and you can partner up because you can cross train on all those applications easily. Talk with your team about your good behaviors, set your standards, talk about the other data and data points that you're working towards, making sure everyone knows they can escalate whenever they need to, and just to reiterate, that sober on-call practice. So a couple of additional resources. These are super helpful things, and some of them are kind of fun to help you out. These are some things on PagerDuty. We actually have this entire talk as a long form document at goingoncall.pagerduty.com. We also have some stuff on the forums. For some other industry resources, Increment, which is published by Stripe, I think their first issue was about on-call. There's some really great articles in there. And then the second to last one there is kind of classic talk from Velocity, where Etsy's team came on to talk about how they were quantifying their on-call. They called it mean time to sleep, but it was super fun because they showed up in onesie pajamas. So, be a little irreverent, right? So you can find that there. Additionally, if you'd like to know more or interact with PagerDuty a little bit, we have our own event coming up in June. We'd love to have you join us. We have some workshops as well as industry talks and things like that. So there's a save the date for that. And then this is where the rest of the documentation is. There's some other things that we didn't go over, but hopefully you can find answers to your questions there, or if not, you can give us a shout. So I'm Mandi Walls, and if you'd like to hit me on Twitter, I'm LNXCHK. But thanks, and enjoy the rest of DevOps Days Vancouver.